In a journalism course I teach called Reporting Civil Rights, we study how even the most radical thinkers and activists frame their demands for equality within the words and structures of the Constitution, how they have simultaneously denounced the Constitution's flaws while relying on its very ideals. From David Walker's 1827 appeal, it's a fiery Jeremiad condemning a slave-holding nation, but structured like the Constitution's articles. Or the Black Panther Party's 1966 10-point program, which is actually modeled on the Constitution's first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. To Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, using very sophisticated constitutional reasoning in such cases as Brown, so persuasively that judge could not resist bending the arc of history toward justice during the mid-20th century rights movement. But I would argue, as have others, that since then, our movements have perhaps over-relied on the courts to secure the civil rights outlined in the Constitution. Recent Supreme Court decisions have reminded us, perhaps dishearteningly but not surprisingly, that savvy constitutional interpretations alone will never overcome social injustices. Rather, as Harvard law professor Nicholas Bowie argues, it is time to revive other tools to build political power. It's time for organizing, it's time for movement building, it's time for legislating. And this means collectively committing not just to the biannual ritual of voting, but also to the day-to-day grit of organizing our neighbors, the people around us, to commit to collective action. And in this way, we might create, once again, a common folk narrative that makes us feel a part of a larger community, indeed a country, even a cause, makes us feel like citizens. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, I just want to thank Professor Lawrence and the Clough Center for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for being here. The title of my reflection, as it were, is A Personal Connection to the United States Constitution. Growing up as the son of a Lebanese immigrant, my understanding of the United States Constitution and its impact on American political life has been filtered through my father's experiences as a naturalized citizen of this country. The Constitution has played a concrete role in my life in the sense that without Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, my father would not be here, and neither would I. Indeed, the ways I reflect on American politics are firmly linked to my family heritage and my father's life here in this nation. He originally left Lebanon in the early 1980s, and in the heat of the Lebanese Civil War, found political refuge in the United States. During this time, Lebanon was disfigured as a result of widespread poverty, the imminent danger of foreign invasion, frequent acts of terrorism, relentless government corruption, and the sheer lack of socioeconomic mobility. Meanwhile, in the United States, my father graduated with a degree at an American university, married my mother, acquired a job with a steady paying income, and started a family in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio. For my father, the positive outcomes of his immigration and citizenship status here have remained an important pillar of his own self-understanding, as well as a litmus test for measuring other forms of political rights around the world. So when I discuss politics with him, he typically makes interpretations and claims by relying on America's successes as opposed to the failures of other countries. Why denounce American democracy when it provided him with an avenue for social freedom and political stability at a time when neither were available in his home country? The original context of his position is understandable and rightfully so. And yet, as a student of history and political thought myself, I cannot help but wonder if there may be flaws in his general acceptance of U.S. politics. how many of those problems from 1970s and 1980s Lebanon find their mirror images in American political life too. While no two events, or places are exactly the same, it is telling how in recent times American culture has manifested many of its uglier shadow sides, from school shootings and police brutality to income inequality and religious extremism. The question of democracy in the United States is just as urgent as other countries that we normally think of as spatially distant, culturally different, or even politically incongruent. I often reflect on the puzzling nature of this difference in opinion that tends to arise in conversation with my Lebanese father. How is it that he, a Lebanese immigrant, is able to affirm the legacy of the American political system as enshrined in the rights of the U.S. Constitution, yet I, an American-born citizen, have less confidence in this framework? Rather than dwell on the theoretical or philosophical claims that may be at stake in this kind of disagreement, I think that my father's point of view and personal connection to the U.S. Constitution offers a very unique perspective for understanding American democracy. For a long time, I examined the meaning of our constitutional rights through a narrow lens of its initial context in the Enlightenment tradition and how today's contemporary culture has responded to this tradition, either critically or affirmatively. While this framework provides various insights, it is unable to fully grasp how a present-day immigrant like my father can endorse the system despite its apparent flaws. The reason for my recently evolved outlook stems from the ways in which my own family experience with a Lebanese-born father has personalized or humanized an interpretation of the U.S. Constitution for me. Conventionally, we think of constitutional rights as abstract political goods with assigned meanings in the form of private property, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and so on. And while these liberties are clearly enumerated in the Constitution, the fact of the matter, for me at least, is that this nearly 250-year-old document does not sink in unless I consider it in relationship to my father. Over the years, and despite some of my qualms with the current state of American politics, the Constitution still retains a personal connection to me, one which I uphold as an integral feature to my own self-understanding as a U.S. citizen. Thank you.
Well, the Constitution for me is a full-time job. And I suspect that makes me not the best person for a panel like this. The Constitution has meant many things to me at different times, and it's meant different things to me as a lawyer, as a law student, as a political scientist, as a scholar, as a teacher. And that has changed what it has meant to me, but also just getting older and the passage of time and witnessing events happen in the world in relation to the Constitution, events happen nationally. Things have happened, and I've rethought positions I've had and even moods I've had about the Constitution. And I've also, in the nature of my job, just read more and more about it and about America and American history more generally. If I were to distill what it means to me now, it embodies, the Constitution embodies for me, a hope for a certain kind of politics in a certain sort of polity. The way I think about the founding now is that it was an effort by a remarkable group of men in the 18th century to create the conditions best suited to setting in motion and sustaining that type of politics. What is that type of politics and what is the basis of that type of politics? You know, in political science, it's some pretty basic concepts. Popular rule, popular sovereignty, we the people, of Schoolhouse Rock. In that sense, the Constitution is a hope for a republic, for popular government. It was a hope of a certain type of government that was calibrated appropriately given the society they knew and who they were, to adequately empower the governments of the United States and to limit the governments of the United States. And if I were to even distill further from that, popular sovereignty, liberal democracy, and republicanism with a small r. Where am I now with the Constitution? I confess I'm not feeling so good. I'm feeling a little sick. The Constitution was always meant to manage political contention in a pluralist polity. Now, I know enough about the history of the United States to generally steer away from saying that bad things are in the present are unprecedented. It is a very raucous and bitter history at times, and it has been even a violent history at some times, including a civil war, which was at base a constitutional dispute, at least for a constitutional law teacher. And I think even acknowledging that difficult history, we are not in a good place right now. For me, January 6th was one of the worst things that ever happened. And I don't just mean the storming of Congress. I mean things that are continuing to happen now. One of the worst things that ever happened constitutionally to the United States. And it's always difficult for me because I think people today, just given the media environment, just move on as if it's routine. There is nothing more important to our system than the peaceful transfer of power between parties in a presidential election. And you know, at least in my mind, at least the Civil War was over a constitutional principle. This seemed to me ridiculous. And so it doesn't even have the dignity of being serious, although the divisions are serious in the country. I realize today that constitutional maintenance depends, even in politics, on a modicum of unwritten norms concerning civic spirit, good faith participation in a pluralist polity, generosity, honor, self-restraint. And I think the current state of the party system is a very real threat to all of that and to the future of the Constitution itself, and to the thing that we political scientists have had difficulty describing. I think social media has played a huge part in this. And it's very difficult for us to sort of get our heads around how different that is from the dynamics that affected the Constitution before. So in closing, I know he's canceled, but I can't help refer to Woody Allen's jokes. I'd like to leave you with a positive message, but as he once joked, would you take 2 negative messages? I think I have to leave you with a question mark in my view. Vindicating the founders' hopes means we need renewed effort to restore an appropriate civic spirit. Will that happen anytime soon or ever? My training as an expert in this subject leads me to say, I really don't know. Thank you very much.
When asked to talk about her mentors, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan frequently tells a story about the great advocate and jurist Thurgood Marshall, for whom Kagan clerked in the 1980s. During the court's 1987-88 term, it heard a case concerning what was, functionally, a secretarial error. On its face, the case was far from challenges under the due process, free exercise, or equal protection clauses which account for many of the court's headline-garnering decisions. Rather, the issue before the court was statutory and procedural. As Kagan regularly recounts, the case was Torres and involved allegations of employment discrimination brought by a group of Hispanic employees in California. The employees lost at the trial level and appealed their case, but one of the plaintiffs' names was left off on the notice of appeal, and the issue before the justices was whether an appellate court had jurisdiction to adjudicate the omitted employee's claim. Justice Marshall's clerks saw a fairly uncomplicated case. What difference, they asked, could it possibly make that there had been an administrative error? Surely, they thought, the anti-discrimination crusading justice for whom they worked would see that a secretarial mishap ought not preclude appellate jurisdiction over the omitted litigant, depriving the man of his claim. The liberal lion, Justice William Brennan, agreed with the best thinking of Kagan and her colleagues, and he explained his reasoning in lone dissent from the Torres majority. For his part, Justice Marshall wrote the opinion for the court. Ruling against the employee alleging discrimination, the decision reflected that the procedural error, in fact, made all the difference. Failure to comply with the relevant procedural rule, Marshall wrote, quote, presents a jurisdictional bar to the appeal irremediable by judicial discretion. In her telling, Justice Kagan acknowledges that Marshall's response to the case may be surprising to some, as it had been surprising to her. But, as she reflects more than 3 decades later, he had spent a whole life litigating cases and knew you cannot expect anyone to bend the rules for you. All you can ask is that they apply the rule straight. And, in personam Marshall, she sometimes adds, people who litigated like I litigated, their salvation was in the rules. If he had a chance at success, she goes on, it was because of the rules. It was because people decided to take those rules seriously. Sometimes it worked against you and they put in the wrong name, but especially for people who were disliked and disadvantaged, you needed those rules. And on that basis, you better make sure you created a system where those rules are there. The lesson, Kagan concludes, was as significant as any she learned from Marshall about the importance of education and eradicating inequality. The possible lessons, it seems, are myriad. Allow me to suggest 2. First, Marshall, through Kagan, teaches that the Constitution is neither a manual nor a magical document which provides for the resolution of every collision between the many, sometimes conflicting good things which it endorses. The same text, whose equal protection and commerce clauses conspire to ground a claim based on employment discrimination, also contains the Due Process Clause, which supports procedural rigorism in service of defendants' rights. And yet, Marshall's life and work testify to the idea that the attempt to resolve such conflicts of values when they arise is not a fool's errand. Indeed, the procedural rules which precluded an appeal of discrimination in Torres had been the solid ground upon which Marshall, the advocate, had himself built case upon case for civil rights in the days before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in employment. Second, and related, Kagan's account of Marshall's decision in Torres teaches that the Constitution itself and legislation promulgated under it are not, perhaps cannot, be interpreted in the same way. The Constitution furnishes a structure according to which legislators and executives and jurists, with the assent of the American people, co-create a system of laws consistent with their best interpretation of principles articulated at the creation. Neither the principles nor the formal elements of the Constitution are served by complete capitulation of one to the other. In its content and in the fact of its telling, Justice Kagan's narrative of the Torres decision captures what the Constitution means to me. In it, bright-line legal rules and a Constitution capable of meeting refined moral standards over decades and centuries exist not in competitive, but in symbiotic relationship. In it, the inveterate advocate is formed, not compromised, as a consummate jurist. And in it, the wisdom of a past which we do not inhabit and which we have not escaped lives on in the student citizens who become its stewards. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Laura Steinberg. I am the executive director of the Schiller Institute and a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I'm going to talk about the Constitution in a personal way, in ways that I've intersected with it over the years of my life, starting from when I was 10 years old. But I promise not to talk for too long. So I happen to have been a very informed and a bookish kid. And I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, at the time in the mid-'60s and late '60s when what was happening was something that was called the urban race riots of the mid-'60s. And those riots were occurring throughout the country, and Newark was one of those places. Detroit was another place, and so was Chicago, among others. And sometime in the mid-'60s, a report came out in 1968 that President Johnson had created a commission. It was called the President's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. This was also called the Kerner Commission report. And so I read that report when I was 14, and cover to cover. And what I read in this report was an analysis about what had happened on the streets of Newark and Detroit and Chicago and other places. And the Kerner Commission wrote in uncompromising language that our nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And it said that white racism was what fueled the riots, putting the problem clearly at the feet of the American people. So I was confused. So as a kid, I was trying to square that with what I had learned from the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal, and from what I knew to be the triumphs we were having as a nation in promoting equality and equity in Brown versus Board of Ed, the Voting Rights Act, the 24th Amendment that outlawed the poll tax. So I knew all these things were happening, but I was seeing in front of me something that was very, very different. And so living in Newark at the time and growing up in what was really a center of black nationalism, I believed the Constitution was letting us down. I was really unhappy and kind of scared for the future. And at the same time, what was happening was that there was this big prevailing rhetoric about anti-communism and the Red Menace. And I started to question whether there was any way that we could construct a government that served all people fairly with compassion, which was a word I actually didn't know when I was 14, and also like for the common good. And I know that over time the Kerner Commission's study has met with much historical critique and review. But I need to say that as a young person reading that study, it really spoke to me of the problems that our country was facing in really uncompromising language. And then, a bit later, along came Watergate, and I was riveted by the Watergate hearings. And I had learned about impeachment as sort of a theoretical provision of the Constitution, invoked only once for the infamous President Andrew Johnson. But now it was playing out in real time in my living room. And it brought up for me the question of what are the moral as well as the legal obligations and standards of conduct that we expect our civic leaders to live up to. And then I was fascinated again as a high school student by the realization that the Constitution wasn't a cut and dry document, that, for example, we needed to debate what an impeachable offense was. What did other high crimes and misdemeanors mean? So then later in high school, I was appointed a congressional page to the 94th Congress. And that's when I saw the provisions of the Constitution working up close. And I have to admit being awed by going to committee meetings and watching the feminist Bella Abzug from New York at work and the great environmentalist Mo Udall from Arizona. And then I was there for the constitutionally mandated Article 2, Section 3, Clause 1, State of the Union address by President Gerald Ford, in which the president is asked to, under that clause, periodically give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. And then later on, I went to grad school in environmental engineering and took an environmental law course in Duke's Law School. And I realized that the material in that course was so central to the efforts that environmental engineering students were making to clean up pollutants and to save ecosystems and biodiverse environments that I needed to educate my fellow grad students and environmental engineering faculty on the aspects of the Constitution that would put our engineering work actually into practice. The Commerce Clause, I learned about. The Spending and General Welfare Clause, I learned about. And the Property Clause, which gives Congress the right to make laws about federal land. So my graduate seminar, when I was supposed to be talking about my research on wastewater digestion tanks, became a kind of a lecture on the constitutional underpinnings of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Fast forward to now, and here I am running the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society. And as some of you may know, the Institute, in conjunction with the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department, just hired 2 of the most acclaimed climate modelers in the world to help us attack the existential crisis posed by society's unrelenting emissions of greenhouse gases. But attempts to use the Clean Air Act to regulate these gases continue to go awry as challenges to EPA regulations attract court challenges or challenges to those regulations, which are met with support at the Supreme Court. For example, earlier this year, the justices decided in West Virginia versus EPA that the EPA is limited in its power to set limits on emissions from coal-fired power plants under the Clean Air Act. For the EPA to go further, Congress would have to be given the authority to regulate, quote, major questions. But since Congress has not made additions to the Clean Air Act since the 1990s, it doesn't appear this is going to happen anytime soon. And an underlying problem in the Clean Air Act is that it spells out specific gases and types of particles for regulation, but doesn't include greenhouse gases, as these were little known 30 years ago. So in summary, the Constitution has provided a constant source of intriguing questions for me to ponder, and it has intersected in significant ways with my life. I return to it again and again, hoping that it is sturdy enough, flexible enough, and fair enough to take all of us safely into the future.
Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Malik. I'm a senior studying political science, and my reflection is respect the Constitution, someone has to. It's not a popular view on campus, but I believe the Constitution is the greatest secular document ever written. At a time when having a written Constitution that laid out the people's rights was virtually unheard of, our founders came together and made it happen. It is a nearly perfect synthesis of a variety of influences, from the ancients to the Judeo-Christian tradition to the Enlightenment. The result has been one of the most stable and effective governing documents ever written, a document that is the bedrock of the nation that has helped hundreds of millions of people prosper and resisted some of the most dangerous totalitarian threats to ever exist. Democracies around the world have adopted many of its principles, such as the separation of powers and checks and balances. Overall, the Constitution has done more to influence and further the Klaus Center's mission of cultivating a political culture of healthy liberal democracy than any other document. It is true that our leaders have not always lived up to the principles outlined in the Constitution. For most of our nation's history, African Americans have been the victims of the barbaric institutions of chattel slavery and Jim Crow segregation, and their constitutional rights have been trampled over and neglected. Women were not able to vote in all elections until 1920, and they were not allowed to own property in their own name until the mid-19th century. There is no doubt that while the United States has had many great successes, we also have our share of failures. But to blame these failures on to blame our shortcomings on the Constitution is unfair. The Constitution put the slave trade on borrowed time, intending to eliminate slavery down the line, and while we all agree it was wrong today, no country allowed women to vote in 1787. One could credibly argue the Constitution should have done more to curb slavery, and it is certainly not a perfect document, but its overall message that government comes from the consent of the people and that there are certain inalienable rights that possessed by all are the key components to establishing a liberal democracy, the form of government which has created the most economic prosperity and the greatest expansion of human rights by a wide margin. Today, the Constitution has many detractors. Most of them argue that it is not majoritarian enough. They want to reform the Senate, abolish the Electoral College, or remove the filibuster, arguing that these things are undemocratic. I completely agree with these critics that the Constitution could be improved considerably if the goal of politics is to make the state as majoritarian as possible. But that is not what the Constitution set out to do, and I believe the founders were wise to install these guardrails. The Constitution establishes a system designed for civil debate and productive discourse, with the end outcome typically some sort of compromise. But increasingly, partisans of all stripes, frustrated by their inability to ram their agendas through, are calling for a more majoritarian governing system. Our politics is now about winning more than protecting people's rights or working to find common ground. An effective constitutional democracy requires balance. The people need means to have their voices heard and must be able to remind the government that it only exists through their consent. But the best constitutional democracies respect the rights of the minority and force political actors to play by the rules, even when it is inconvenient to their political goals. While our Constitution has faced some of its stiffest tests in recent years, and more are likely coming as the obsession with winning engulfs more of our political discourse, thus far it has held up against every challenge and slowed our descent into demagoguery. That said, even a document as great as the Constitution cannot uphold the Republic alone. As John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. To preserve our country, we need to look to the Constitution as the frame that guides politics and upholds order, rather than as an obstruction to partisan victories and our side winning. If the Constitution is discarded, we all lose.
Josman Ospino. I'm a professor of theology in the School of Theology and Ministry, where I also serve as the department chair of the DREPM. I am a theologian, an immigrant, a man, a spouse, a parent, a Roman Catholic, an advocate. When I was invited to think about what does the Constitution mean to me, I could have written 5 minutes of remarks on each of these, perhaps an hour, maybe more. But I chose one, an immigrant. Why do so many immigrants, or so many people throughout the world, want to come to the United States of America and become part of this nation? Jacob already answered part of my question. I was born in Colombia, South America, and migrated to the United States 25 years ago. Migrating to the United States of America meant that I left not only my family, friends, culture behind, but also a particular way of being a citizen in Colombia. That particular way of being a citizen in Colombia was shaped by history, by convictions, and also by ideals that the people who wrote the Constitution there had in their minds at the time of doing so. It was shaped by an understanding of what it means to be human, an understanding of what it means to be a community, and ultimately an understanding of what it means to be a nation. Colombia also has a rather new constitution, which was drafted in 1991. That constitution within which I grew up was written in 1886. I was 16 years old when I saw a nation change its constitution, change the grammar that made it what it was. Each of these constitutions, 1886, 1991, reflected two different ways of being, two different ways of being a nation. When I migrated to the United States of America, I was exposed to my third constitution. Now, this time, I was not given a constitution, I was embracing one constitution. And let me just be transparent with you. I did not come to the United States of America because of the Constitution. I did not read the Constitution prior to migrating to the United States of America, most likely as most immigrants never read the Constitution prior to coming here. But we came to the United States of America and wanted to become part of this nation because of the mystery and the magic that the Constitution created and makes this nation be what it is. Of course, not perfect. Of course, always with room for development and growth. As an immigrant, I did not take the idea of citizenship for granted or lightly. For many years, my wife and I, my wife also an immigrant, discerned whether we wanted to be citizens of the United States of America. And we thought about what it meant, the commitments. And it was by reading together precisely the Constitution that we made that commitment. We said yes, because we believed in what this document is actually attempting to do in this nation. I don't take the Constitution of the United States of America for granted today either. I chose to be a citizen of this nation, mindful of its values and its commitments, mindful of its limitations. I studied the Constitution and pondered about its commitments. What does the Constitution mean to me? The Constitution of the United States of America means that I choose, as an immigrant, to be part of the way of being human that appears in this particular document. I choose to be part of the community that this document has put together or brought together. And I choose the particular way of being a nation that the Constitution continues to inspire. I have two children, the children of immigrants. Now I, the immigrant who chose the nation, is teaching my children how to love not only the United States of America, but its Constitution. And I'm not the only one. Millions of American citizens born and raised in the United States of America are growing up with immigrants like me, teaching them the Constitution and the miracle that the Constitution has created in this nation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Megan McCoy. I'm a graduate student in the history department. And before I start reading this piece, I just wanted to say that there are a couple of phrases in it that are either directly borrowed or mildly adapted from Emma Lazarus's 1883 poem, The New Colossus. So if you're familiar with it, you may recognize some of the lines. On Sunday, July 24th, my uncle committed suicide. A lifetime of depression, loneliness, and liquor had become his daily theme. And I imagine that when one can no longer make it to the bathroom, any sense of purpose or meaning crystallizes into bleakness quite quickly. My uncle was not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, and he didn't live a life that you could say resembled someone particularly bold or magnificent, who seemed to exist with conquering limbs astride from land to land. He lived his final years at my grandmother's house, completing a routine schedule that consisted of Walmart, sports games, and grocery shopping. When I called to talk with her, he never asked to speak with me, and I'm ashamed to say that I never asked to speak with him. Such, I suppose, is the nature of regret. Now, exactly 1 week to the day of his passing, as I sit and try to think about what the United States Constitution means to me, I can't seem to think of anything remotely patriotic. Instead, all I can think about is that here at our sea-washed, sunset gate still stands a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning that the Constitution is supposed to represent. And to me, that lightning is not a flame that burns or destroys, but one that protects, accepts, and cares for all those who have been made vulnerable. I think that as a country, the United States has often mistaken power for strength and violence for conviction, and forgotten that the name of this mighty woman, mother of exiles, is an ideal to cherish and not discard. For wasn't the Constitution written by exiles and then changed for the better by those who knew that the United States could never glow worldwide welcome if it continued to hate against everyone who makes this world, and thus this country, so beautiful? I once read that fear is the only thing that can defeat life. And over the past several years, I believe we've all seen far too many instances when fear has been victorious and turned a torch that welcomes into a weapon. If I ever have children, I don't want them to believe that the Constitution is nothing more than a hypocritical document that talked pretty, but often walked so brutally and inconsistently, ensuring rights and dreams for some, but denying them to others. I want them to understand that mild eyes command better than angry ones, and the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame is not meant to be possessively guarded or sealed off, but instead lined with compassion, equity, and as much decency as we flawed human beings can muster. The Constitution shouldn't mean more to me because it shouldn't guarantee more to me than it does to anybody else. The Constitution, as impressive as it is not perfect, and it should never be treated as a stagnant relic, but a living, breathing reflection of our continued striving for truth, humanity, and holistic justice. The Constitution is a promise, one that cries with silent lips, "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," except I think here the storied pomp is our own lack of courage to fortify in the Constitution that which protects all people, and to change that which no longer serves our country. In early July, I visited an exhibit at the Chicago History Museum on, of all things, constitutional freedom. A small sign introducing the exhibit explained that the word freedom isn't actually written once in the entire Constitution, and thus all Americans would have to fight to define what freedom meant for themselves. This country's history is littered with innumerable instances of what freedom isn't. And today we once again face the daunting challenges that reiterate just how precarious freedom can be and how ardently it must be protected. And nothing, even the rights we thought were inalienable, can be taken for granted. When I read the final few lines of Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, as a human, I'm filled with hope. Yet as a graduate student in history, I'm filled with sadness. This poem was written only a small handful of years after the Civil War destroyed much of the country, and the promises of Reconstruction turned out to be hollow and bitter. Native American tribes would continue to face land removal, endless broken treaties, and be decimated by war and disease. The list of horrors, both before and after the Constitution was written, have continued, and today fill a heartbreaking number of pages that still doesn't seem to end. Yet I keep returning over and over again to this poem. In the wake of my family's loss, the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," remind me of ourselves, that right now many of us are the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Despair, fear, and resentment are powerful obstacles, yet they are not insurmountable. In its best form, the Constitution is an ideal, a wish of how we might do better than the generations that came before, and an inspiration to build on the legacies of those who fought for a Constitution that would honestly care for and protect all of us. Every single person in this country, in this room, deserves a foundational document that gives them nothing less, and I refuse to believe that we are not capable of achieving it. Compassion is not a weakness, and idealism is not a marker of foolishness. I hope for the day when the Constitution truly embodies both and casts the same light, warmth, and luminous freedom as a lamp lifted beside the golden door. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Kathy Caveney from the Law School and the Theology Department. What is the Constitution? Well, I began thinking about this question by turning to the preamble, which I am going to read but not sing because that would be a violation of the Geneva Convention. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Then follows the 7 articles of the Constitution, the 27 amendments, the first 10 of which are the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was written in 1787, ratified the next year, and in operation since 1789. How do I think about it? Well, drawing on my experience as both a lawyer and a theologian, I think of it as a secular scripture on the one hand, or a sacred compact on the other. By secular, I don't mean irreligious, but of or pertaining to an age or to an era. If you think of the Latin phrase in secula seculorum, from age to age or forever, you get the idea. Our Constitution was designed to constitute and to accompany a people from age to age. It is broader than a contract and more capacious than a will. By sacred, I actually mean both meanings of sacer in Latin. On the one hand, sacred, holy, and consecrated, and on the other hand, accursed, horrible, and detestable. It is sacred, holy, and consecrated in its vision of liberty and equality. But in some respects, it is also accursed, horrible, and detestable. William Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution a covenant with death, an agreement with hell, because of its entrenched racism and slavery, without even mentioning the word. What do I mean by saying our Constitution is our nation's scripture, our secular scripture? Well, the key words here are, I think, as many people have noted, we the people. They are intrinsically related to thinking of the Constitution as a kind of scripture. If you think of religious scriptures, such as the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, the scriptures constitute the people, and the people interpret and give life to the scriptures. The people and the scriptures are mutually defining. The Hebrew Bible, for example, shows that the Jewish people are constituted by their covenant with God. As they move through time, they reaffirm and reinterpret the application of that covenant to them. But there are also stories in both the Old and the New Testament, in both the Christian and the Jewish scriptures, about how the people failed the scriptures and even how the scriptures failed the people. That is true of sacred scripture, but also of our secular scripture, the Constitution. Honoring our Constitution means recognizing the ways in which we have failed it, and it has failed us. How? Well, let us go back to that key phrase, we the people. Who are the people? Not just the founders who signed the document, nor the population of the original 13 colonies, for that matter. We the people is us, as we stand in both continuity and difference with them. Even if we weren't there or could not have been there because we are women, people of color, certain kinds of immigrants with certain kinds of histories. We take their original ideas, extend it, transform it, and correct it as we move through time. We then hand the label, we the peoplehood of our nation, onto the next generation as their gift and their task. And they do the same with us in audacity and humility. We the people, I think, is the key to the text and to the country. What is its basic challenge? In my view, it is negotiating the tensions of particularity and unity on the level of individuals, families, communities, states, and the nation itself. One of our nation's earliest mottos is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It was on the first Great Seal approved by Congress in 1782. We have done this negotiation well at times. As Jacob Saliba noted, the 14th Amendment states that all persons born in the U.S., no matter where they are from, are citizens of the U.S. Our unity is enriched in each generation with each child's birth with diversity. We have recognized the creativity of immigrants and their place among us. As Megan McCoy's quotation from Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty has noted. But we have also done this badly in our treatment and expropriation of the land of Native Americans, in our enslavement and appropriation of the bodies of African Americans, and in our betrayal of our own citizens on the basis of fear, when the United States Supreme Court permitted the internment of Asian Americans in camps in the course of World War II. Is there a second chance, a third chance, and a fourth chance? Is there mercy in the interpretation of our secular scripture? Well, I do think that in remembering our flaws and humbly confessing them, we can begin to correct them. But we also need appropriate interpretations, appropriate glosses to our scripture. We need the hope kindled by Martin Luther King, who corrected the Constitution in the light of Declaration of Independence when we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, all people are created equal. But we also need the humility and compassion of Abraham Lincoln in his second inaugural address, when he urged us to not forget our sins, but to bind up our wounds with malice toward none and charity for all. That is what the Constitution means to me. And I have hope, even if it's a chastened hope, that it will continue to mean much to the generation that follows mine. Thank you.
Hello, I am Jessie Julian, and I'm actually a freshman studying neuroscience. And my poem is called It's Still in Work Today. Summer 1787. fighting for the principle, protecting liberty for all, finding direction, what's right and what is left, when search and seizure are now considered theft, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition, framework for the government made with good judgment, altered with amendments to fix the accidental dents. I live under protection, away from misdirection. In this country, I feel safe, but there's still so much to change, like women's rights in healthcare, and breathing cleaner air, controlling the pandemic, and better academics in fall 2022. Thank you.
My name is Vlad Perju. I am a professor at the law school. I am a scholar of comparative constitutional law, as it will come through my remarks entitled Ask the Hard Questions. The question of constitutional meaning is at the front and center of our national conversation. As well, it should be. Does constitutional meaning change over time? Look at Dobbs. It's not a hard question. Yes, it does. How constitutional meaning changes over time is only a slightly harder question. It changes when the justices of the Supreme Court change, when doctrines that seek to stabilize constitutional meaning, what lawyers call stare decisis, become weaker, when political, cultural, social forces align to bring about such change. But there is a further and, to my mind, harder question. Why only some constitutional meanings change, but not others? Take two examples out of many. First, the Eighth Amendment prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. Take not capital punishment, though that would work too. Take the punishment of life in prison without the possibility of parole for children, or, to speak law, for juvenile offenders. It has long been the constitutional meaning of cruel and unusual that it is compatible, with some qualifications, with these forms of punishment. Why? Not a terribly easy question, but essentially because the community standards by which to interpret punishments as cruel and unusual, those standards allow it. Now, the hard question. How to define the community? If defined narrowly, then these harsh punishments will be allowed, and perhaps with others, some even more cruel. But what if we define it broadly? The world community has long retired both the death penalty and life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for children, but not only, from the repertoire of humane and decent punishments available to the state. My second and last example. The meaning of constitutional equality and constitutional liberty does not mandate in the United States state officials to pass laws or enact mechanisms that meet the social needs of individual right holders. It does not recognize, that is, a right of access to health care, a right to education, or adequate nutrition, or shelter, or access to sanitation. Why not? Easy question, it seems, because the Supreme Court said so. It did in the context of education in a case it decided in the early 1970s. Interestingly, it was a 5-4 decision. Constitutional meaning settled, cast in stone by one vote. Why hasn't that meaning changed? Not an easy question, but not a terribly hard one either, because of a concern that the holding to the contrary would open the Pandora's box of positive rights, of obligations on the government to do things, as opposed to refrain from doing something, like interfering with speech, or discriminating, or torturing people. And that a constitution of positive rights is unimaginable. Now, the hard question. Is it unimaginable? It's certainly been imagined and for some time now implemented with some considerable success in the constitutional system of other political communities that are both committed to the rule of law and to a market economy. Ask the hard questions of the Constitution and of ourselves. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Warrick, and I'm a student in the law school. So the Constitution's meaning to me has shifted throughout my lifetime. Growing up in the United States, we are taught about the Constitution from a young age. My first understanding of the Constitution was as an artifact, part of our nation's history. The Constitution is a physical document, which I saw in person at the National Archives on a family vacation to Washington, D.C. I knew the framers drafted the document to establish our three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. I also knew the original document had serious shortcomings, which led to the passage of 27 amendments. The amendments were what captured my attention in high school history classes. Not merely a set of laws governing our country, the amendments were a timeline, an illustration of victories and battles for rights that had been denied for too long. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. In 1920, women gained the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. These major amendments were landmarks, signaling new eras in American history. They indicated progress toward fulfilling the truth set out in the Declaration of Independence that all humans have unalienable rights. Had the 19th Amendment not been ratified, I would not have the right to vote. However, the Constitution also served as a reminder of the work remaining to be done to advance rights and equality. As a law student, I've considered the ways in which we can use the Constitution to advance civil rights. My understanding of the Constitution changed significantly from my first day of law school. More than a historical record, the Constitution is an essential framework, the supreme law of the United States. In my first year of law school, I learned contracts, property, and criminal law, to name a few subjects. Although these legal areas differed, they shared the common principle that no regulation, statute, or law may violate the United States Constitution. My constitutional law class afforded me the opportunity to take a deep dive into the meaning and significance of the Constitution. We studied Supreme Court cases that established the foundational principle of judicial review, defined the bounds of legislative power, and secured fundamental rights for United States citizens. While other areas of law that my classmates and I studied seemed abstract and removed from daily life, constitutional law's impact on our lives and choices was eminently clear. The Dobbs decision leaked days before my constitutional law final exam. When learning about Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, some of my classmates shared their views and feelings about abortion and how people's lives would change should the Supreme Court overturn Roe and Casey. We discussed the Supreme Court's power to expand, uphold, and restrict rights through its interpretation of the Constitution. During my internship with the United States Attorney's Office this past summer, I worked on investigations that used the Constitution and federal statutes to enforce the civil rights of marginalized populations throughout Massachusetts. I engaged in research relating to the 14th Amendment right to bodily integrity and the 8th Amendment right to freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. I learned that where individuals were subject to cruel and unusual punishment or their bodily integrity was violated, the amendments can be invoked as tools to combat these harms. Beyond the amendments, I worked on investigations involving the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I view these laws as extensions of the Constitution, working to ensure that all Americans equally and equitably enjoy the fundamental rights outlined in the Constitution. So, what does the Constitution mean to me? I would have given you a different answer at each stage of my life. Today, my answer is that the Constitution is the foundation of my legal aspirations. By combining constitutional law and civil rights work, I believe that attorneys have the power to make a real difference in affecting individual and systemic change throughout the country. I eagerly await the day I can obtain my law degree to join this fight. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Peter Krause. I'm a professor in political science and international studies. I am not a constitutional scholar, and that's not a coincidence. I research and teach about political violence, national movements, and Middle East politics, in part because when I was growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s, I felt that despite significant involvement of the United States in the region, the Middle East was a key area that few Americans, including me, really understood. And I thought that this lack of understanding significantly endangered both Americans and the many proud peoples of the Middle East. American democracy was something that had its flaws, but that I and many others at the time assumed was in decent shape and not under significant threat. 2 decades later, things have changed. I speak to you today as a proud but very concerned American. To me, the Constitution is impressive. It's impressive because it was so much better than anything that had come before or existed at the time, and its creators deserve to be praised for their bravery and genius in winning our country's independence and subsequently designing a real lasting democracy. I study national movements, and let me tell you, the vast majority never achieve self-rule, and many of those who do effectively fight for freedom then fail to effectively consolidate it with strong institutions, backsliding into tyranny. Our Constitution is one of the biggest reasons we have had a relatively stable and successful democracy for 2.5 centuries. However, the Constitution is also inadequate. It is inadequate because although it was better than what had come before, it was not enough to live up to our founding principles, treating all of us as whole people, equally, with the right to vote and participate fully in government and society. Thankfully, after generations of struggle, some of those inadequacies were addressed in constitutional amendments. Nonetheless, the Constitution remains inadequate and inadequately protected for a vibrant, healthy democracy. And in this, I echo the great words from Professor Arts and Professor Kirsch, both on the need to work outside the system in terms of social movements and the importance of norms. Some say that American democracy was a system designed by angels so that it could be run by devils. America's founders were certainly no angels, nor were they representative of a society as a whole. However, they did skillfully design a revolutionary system of government while not being embedded in partisan politics, as robust political parties like we have today did not exist in the 18th century United States. In fact, parties and factions had a bad name at the time of the American Revolution and the Constitution, so much so that George Washington devoted a third of his 1796 farewell address to warning about the dangers of political parties. In it, he argued that parties, quote, serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party. They are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Rarely have more prescient words been spoken. Politicians come and go, but the foundations of American democracy is its liberal institutions embodied in our Constitution. Free and fair elections, an independent judiciary, a free press, an apolitical military and intelligence services, to name a few. George Washington, America's first and most important leader, recognized this when he willingly left the presidency in a time with no term limits, placing the country and its nascent institutions over personal ambition. These institutions protect American values that are not the sole property of any individual or party, and they embody foundational principles of freedom, equality, and justice that structure our politics and society. Unfortunately, each of these institutions, which are supposed to be impartial public servants, are themselves increasingly penetrated by partisanship, as the number of institutionalists who put process over party continues to decline. Instead of a system designed by nonpartisans to weaken the influence of partisans, over time, American democracy became a system designed by partisans for partisans. Whether gerrymandering, in which politicians pick their voters, not the other way around, secretaries of state that openly aim to shift the rules and outcomes of elections to favor their own parties, or an increasingly partisan and polarized Supreme Court whose nomination process, oral arguments, and decisions are increasingly captive to the same power-seeking parties that have ossified Congress, the Constitution and the democracy it created are currently being warped in spirit and in practice. In some sense, we shouldn't be surprised that the Constitution is inadequate. One can read it in under a half an hour. I know because I did right before I came here, and I said, how long will it take? The entire basis of our country can be consumed in less time than it takes to watch a single episode of a television show. We've had nearly the same Constitution for the last 50 years, more than my entire lifetime. And yet so much has changed in our politics and society in that period. I realize now that the Constitution is just a foundation, and that every generation has to work tirelessly to fill in the gaps, to protect the Constitution and ensure that its application reflects our true values. How many of us here truly define ourselves as institutionalists or even know what that means? Where is the robust movement whose primary purpose is to promote and protect the Constitution and the liberal rights and institution that it establishes, rather than to do everything possible to degrade the process on the path to power and influence? The fight for a more perfect union lives on, and it requires a new generation to do something that is unfamiliar to most of us. Passionately struggle for process, not just party, and fight first and foremost for the values and institutions the Constitution established. Thinking about what the Constitution means to me and to all of us is a good start. But there is a lot of hard work to ensure that 20 years from now, when this ceremony is hopefully still going, and hopefully marked by optimism for the healthy democracy we have built, rather than wistful speeches about how it all went wrong. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Boyu. I'm a sophomore in school's International Studies program. And the title of my reflection is The Lesson That the Constitution is Reminding Us Today. I see the Constitution as the child of compromises. Its greatest complexity lies within its capability to unite different factions of our society through balancing their influences and allowing compromises to be made. In a sense, the Constitution was created through people compromising, and it serves the purpose to ensure people in the future can compromise while making decisions. The Constitution is the cornerstone to our democracy because being able to compromise is what makes a democratic society possible. People who fail to make preferable decisions need to be able to compromise with the result, while people who had a majority ruling need to compromise with those that lost for compensating part of their interest. And this is what keeps the democratic society united and strong. However, what I'm witnessing today is that compromises are becoming harder and harder to reach between people with different backgrounds and opinions. Arguments are becoming more extreme, and the capacity to tolerate and agree is much reduced. Therefore, we're in need of reminding ourselves of the root of our democracy, this ability to hear, understand, and compromise, in order to move away from the personal and partisan interests and focus on the common good. The inability to compromise has significantly reduced our responsiveness to problems such as climate change and social injustice. And this is not only hurting our own interest and unity. Our lack of leadership and role in combating international and environmental crises have lowered the world's faith over democratic institutions and processes, as many countries have turned themselves toward China and their so-called authoritarian environmentalism, or maybe possibly environmental authoritarianism. Hence, consider more through thinking and putting yourself in others' perspectives. Compromises are made through knowing others' concerns are as important as yours. Being able to compromise is the lesson from learning the Constitution today. The Constitution is only the protector of our freedom and liberty when we are able to compromise. Otherwise, it will become the handcuff of our own progression. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Brendan Mahoney, and I am a sophomore history major, and my reflection is titled The Ills of a Paramount Constitution Without Evolution. Perhaps the most contemporary yet permanent debate of the U.S. Constitution is whether or not it should be interpreted strictly or loosely. This debate has existed for almost the entire lifetime of the Constitution. It first materialized over Thomas Jefferson's advocacy against the National Bank of the United States, in opposition to the pro-bank stance of Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson's argument consisted in the fact that there was a lack of constitutionality in the bank, as it was not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. This debate began a mere 4 years after the Constitution was originally written. This debate began in 1791, showing the contemporariness of the Constitution in this instance. Madison, an ally of Jefferson on this debate, in 1788 argued that the Constitution should be, quote, the paramount law of the land, to be obeyed above all else. There was no problem with a strict interpretation of the Constitution in the late 18th century because it was created so recently. The Constitution was a document built for the time of Thomas Jefferson. If the Constitution had remained a living document, as George Washington had argued for in his farewell address, which had been mentioned previously, as he claimed that the Constitution, quote, contained within itself provision for its own amendment, then this Constitution would garner support from the masses and would evoke confidence from the masses as well. This argument that I'm making is not necessarily against the strict interpretation of the Constitution from James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. This debate was just a prelude to the seemingly never-ending debates on how the Constitution should be understood. The argument that I'm making is rather against the modern adherence to the Constitution strictly in its current state. We live in a world that is vastly different from the 18th century, to say the least. Comparing the Constitution in the United States to another democracy such as France, for example, there is so much more change and contemporization in the French Constitution. For starters, even though France originally declared itself a republic only 2 years after we did, they have had 15 different constitutions from then to present. Additionally, their most recent constitution in 1958 has had 24 amendments over 64 years. Yet, the Constitution in the United States has only had 27 amendments over 234 years. So, the French average an amendment around every 3 years, while the United States averages one around every 9. Somehow, this doesn't seem to add up. It is not solely that we need more amendments, but it is also that we need more amendments that reflect contemporary issues. To use France again as an example, France enacted several liberal amendments, while the United States is not. In 2005, France created an environmental charter focusing on sustainability and renewability, incorporating it directly into their constitution. The French still believe in the rigidity of their constitution. They definitely believe that it should be interpreted strictly, but that's only dependent on the fact that the Constitution is updated frequently. If the definition of having a constitution that is paramount, as Madison had hoped, was applied to France, strict constitutionalism is totally appropriate. But in this day and age, this definition is not being applied to France by modern Americans. It is being applied by modern Americans to our own Constitution, which averages an amendment only every 9 years. The Constitution in the United States is an anachronistic document in this day and age, so strict constitutionalism is essentially defunct. It is not the same to say that you want an AR-15 under protection of the Second Amendment as it was for the colonists to say that they wanted a musket to protect their family from patrolling British soldiers. On the same token, it is not the same to claim free speech under protection of the First Amendment when you're spewing hateful messages anonymously on social media. The Constitution must evolve through amendments or some other type of revision if it is to stay viable in the 21st century. It is true that the Constitution needs to be the backbone of the law in the United States. Nobody is denying that. But in order for a backbone to exist, it must be strong. Think about it like a suspension bridge. The bridge cannot exist without the suspension portions. But at the same time, if the suspension on the bridge is not strong, the bridge will also collapse. If the Constitution is the suspension and the bridge is democracy, it is clear that democracy needs a constitution. However, without a strongly evolved constitution, democracy collapses. Every bridge needs routine maintenance and updating in order to maintain functionality, and in this case, maintain democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And to each of the speakers, I really, truly enjoyed listening to you. It was moving, it was amusing, it was instructive, it was so many things at once, and it's what I love about a university campus. So thank you all for participating. We do have the opportunity for anyone in the audience who hasn't had the chance to say something, if you would like to. You are welcome to raise your hands and do so. Yes.
So thank you so much, everyone. I'm here. Thanks for all of these great conversations here. First of all, I'm really disappointed at this event. Like not many people are attending this event. I'm a bit surprised that I think less than 1% of the university population is here. I am originally from Iran, and I came to this country not because I necessarily wanted to immigrate first, but then over time I realized I love this country and I feel belonging here. I have experienced authoritarianism back in my country for more than 2 decades, and I'm surprised and I'm shocked to see what's happening in this country and how unbelievable it is for me to see objective reasoning being replaced by subjective reasoning, especially in the past 6-7 years. I have written some points. I don't know if I should go over them. It might take, I don't know, 5 minutes. It might become a lecture, but
Just share one with us because we do have to get to the reception.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, sure. Let me go over my points to see which one's kind of more important. And give me a few seconds, please. Okay, so yeah, maybe the most important thing for me, of course there are so many, but maybe this is the thing that I've been thinking mostly recently about, is that in my country, maybe I would say 2% or at most 5% of the population is in positions of power. And they came to positions of power after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And they've become more and more detached from the reality of what's happening on the ground, basically from people's will. They came to power based on that, and then they got detached, of course. And they've got more and more detached. They've got more and more kind of minorities kind of being in positions of power. But what I see because of the U.S. Constitution, the framework that the way I interpret it, it's so surprising to me how, like, a country like Iran, maybe 95% of the population are being ruled by some kind of authoritarian government, some people who never want to give any power to anyone. And no one can get any power from them because they have military power and everything. What's surprising and so beautiful about this country, the United States, and the framework that the framers designed for this country, at least to me, the way I see it, is 99.9% of this country's power were in the hands of white men, maybe some of them racist, maybe some of them sexist, but because of the framework that they believed in, because of the values that came from humanistic values that came from Christianity. I'm not a Christian, I'm not a religious person at all, but because of those values that I see, they're put into this framework, they allow diffusion of power. The fact that these days I see many people, sadly, victimize minorities. Not that it doesn't exist, like racism and sexism, but the way I see it is really sad. The way they are being used as a tool for political agendas is really sad, because the same people who are claiming that minorities or whoever doesn't have power, or this country is, the Constitution or everything is bad, they are having these conversations because the Constitution gave them the power to say these things. And it's really, really, really sad to me to see these things happening in this country.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you very much for sharing those reflections. Would anybody else like to have the microphone? We can certainly continue the conversation, but before we do go to the reception, I just wanted to make the first of two announcements of the best entry to this contest, and then I'll invite Laura Steinberg up to give the other. So the award for Best Essay on What the Constitution Means to Us is awarded to Emily Turner for her essay on Marshall, Kagan, and What the Constitution Means to Me. Emily had to go to a class, but we are thrilled to recognize her work. And let me just call up Laura for the other.
And I was sitting next to Emily, and she said that she wanted to come and talk, but she was really being urged quite strongly to be sure to come and talk. I don't think she realized there was a prize for her at the end here. So she's, I'm sure we'll get that to her. But what I'm here to do is present to Jesse Julian a prize that the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society created for the best essay that focused on what the Constitution means to me with respect to one of our signature areas, energy, environment, and health. And Jesse wrote just a beautiful, moving poem on those topics. So I want to congratulate you on the poem, which you read to us, and also provide you with the certificate. And you also get a nice check along with that.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks again to all of you for being here. And please stay and continue to discuss, and I look forward to the following. Thanks. Bye.